This video is mostly audio, so please consider enjoying it while you play Scarlet Spear. Before I talk about every arcane one by one, here's my shortlist if you have very little time or desire to play this event but want some powerful stuff. For my money, 3 of the best general use arcanes you could buy are, okay, obviously Energize, and then Guardian and Arachne. So Guardian is another one you're probably familiar with. Guardian is just a very good defensive arcane. Adding flat armor to any frame is very good. Making pretty much anyone tanky is pretty good. With adaptation, you can have a lot of damage reduction. Arachne is probably the harder sell, and then of course we'll do the obligatory segment on Energize. So Arachne gives you base damage when you wall latch to all of your weapons for 30 seconds. Now wall latching is extremely easy. You literally just need to go up to a wall while in midair and aim glide for like a millisecond and you get this. It doesn't have to be, it used to be that you needed to do it for 2 seconds. That got changed. Now it's just wall latch for an instant. You get base damage on everything. So functionally, what this does is allow you to run an extra mod on all your weapons, because you can just take off the base damage you already have, since you are getting it from this source instead. And on your primary and your melee, you're often not losing damage. In fact, in your melee, if you were running Prime Pressure Point, you may be gaining damage depending on how high it's ranked up. And on your secondary, sure, Hornet Strike gives you 220% base damage. This only gives you 150, but that's still pretty good. You're getting most of the damage, and having another mod slot for something other than more base damage can increase your weapon's damage by more. So this can be a great option, and if you're sick of running the same mods on everything, this is a fantastic mod for you, and it does that on basically every weapon in the entire game. So a very, very good choice for that purpose. If you're not into that, you don't want to wall latch, let's say, Avenger is also a solid general damage choice. The main thing here is that this is additive critical chance. It's flat critical chance. It gives you 45% more no matter what your weapon's crit chance is, so it's good on pretty much everything. But now that we've talked about those, and again, there's really nothing to say about Energize. It gives you more energy on everyone. Let's talk about each of them one by one. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of other good arcanes. Those are just the ones I would recommend if you have like no time or desire to play the event and you just want to get something useful. So now I'm going to go through every arcane one by one from cheapest to most expensive. So we're starting at the top here. And if you are going to plan to play this event a lot for the next month, I hope that this helps you decide what to buy, because I do think a lot of these are a waste of time in their current state, and skipping them would save you a lot of farming. So one quick note that Scarlet Spear doesn't sell literally every Warframe arcane. There are a few from arbitrations that aren't sold here, and I won't be discussing them now, but for what it's worth, they're all pretty solid. So okay, starting with the commons, that's 1,000 Scarlet bucks each, so that's 21,000 for a max rank arcane. Now remember, these tooltips are showing you the max rank effect, but the cost shown is for a single copy. So you need 21 purchases to get the listed effect here if you don't already have any. Starting with Arcane Tempo. So this is easy to activate for pellet-based shotguns, and it's a lot of fire rate. It's great when it's good. It's good for follow-up shots, even on slow shotguns, since your damage is concentrated in one trigger pull. Consequence. Consequence makes you fast, it's consistent, it's easy to get just a headshot. Your Sentinel can activate this too. Some weapons that are good for activating that are the Sweeper and the Sweeper Prime. Death Machine Rifle and Death Machine Rifle Prime have a little weak accuracy, which can end up being an advantage because you'll get a stray headshot here and there. And really anything with punch through, you have a decent chance. To have your Sentinel just activate this, which is great. Obviously, this is also great for racing. I have my Drift Frame Capture Mission races, and this is amazing for that. But it's solid for farming as well, and it's just not that expensive, you know. Arcane Momentum. So this is pretty easy for most snipers to activate, and it's very relevant on most of them. And it also has a pretty unique effect. It's not part of a cycle. There are no other reload speed arcanes. So this is pretty solid. It's a lot of reload speed. Our sources of reload speed in Warframe are not very big, and this lasts for a long time. It's easy to activate. Pretty good on most snipers, obviously better on some than others. It's pretty solid. There's a good damage increase. Arcane Ice. This is one of those effects that, while not literally useless, is vastly inferior to the many other powerful benefits arcanes can offer. So getting heat procced is just not a big deal, and despite the confusing wording, these don't prevent elemental damage, just the status effect. So again, it says 102% chance to resist a heat damage effect. Well, a heat damage effect is called a status effect. I don't know why it just doesn't say a status effect, but it makes you resist heat status effects. It doesn't really have to do with damage directly. Of course, heat effects do a little damage, but anyway, It makes you resist status effects. I don't know what's up with the wording. It makes you resist status effects. Nullifier, same thing, but magnetic is actually a pretty bad status effect for Warframes. Magnetic will scramble your minimap, and it drains your shields and energy, which is a big deal. Like, the energy loss is the big problem. But it's troublesome, and this prevents that. This is obviously most notable for Eidolon fights, where between the different phases of the fight, you lose your energy for a bunch of magnetic proc waves. But it's not horrible in some other situations, and it's just good where it's good. Solid Arcane, very much the opposite end of the spectrum of these ones that negate status effects from Ice here. This is like a good effect to negate. And then we, continuing on to Arcane Warmth. When do you ever get cold procs? But this one, I have to say this is kind of good, because this one time I challenged fellow Warframe partner Gurate Tacos to a drift frame capture mission race, and she used this on the Corpus tile that we were racing on, and I lost because I got cold procced to one of those stupid cold barrels, and she was immune, so I am legally obligated to say that this is not a worthless arcane, but you shouldn't buy it. Anyway, moving on to uncommon ones. So these are 1,500 Scarlet bucks each, which means it's 31,500 for a max rank arcane. Resistance, so this one makes you not get toxin procs. Toxin goes through shields, so this had some limited use, I suppose. There's not much else to say here. Likewise, Arcane Healing, there are radiation hazard sorties. I think a lot of people in the audience think of radiation hazard sorties as an advantage rather than a disadvantage, but if you want to take that mission seriously instead of trolling, then this helps you avoid that, so it's good in that way. Likewise, man, there's a lot of these all in one block. This makes you resist slash procs, which go through armor. Like, I guess there are some frames that's gonna kill them real good because their defense is all armor. Nowadays, there are so many forms of damage reduction available to us that are not armor that I feel like this is less of a big deal than it used to be. And now that slash doesn't go through shields, and our shields have damage reduction, and adaptation is as ubiquitous as ever, I really don't think this is a big deal, but I do think this is better than most of its type. The slash procs are threatening, but again, like, it's very important to remember that this doesn't make you immune to the damage type, it just makes you immune to slash procs, not slash damage sources. Arcane Victory, so finally one that's interesting to talk about. This is basically a proactive but weaker Arcane Grace. When you get a headshot kill, you heal for a % of your health, max health, for a little while, every second. So 3% of max health for 9 seconds. That's not half bad. That's 27% of your health. Like, sweet, right? And the chance to activate is pretty high. You do have to get a headshot kill. That's a notable problem. But it's still pretty decent. In the past, it was kind of a cheaper Arcane Grace, but now you cannot run 2 Arcane Grace copies. So you might as well run this and Arcane Victory. I think I mostly recommend this alongside Grace. Like, on frames where you would use Grace, I would use this. I think the fact that this triggers on something you do, something proactive, like you get a headshot kill, rather than something enemies do, shooting you, damaging you, like Arcane Grace, is an advantage of Arcane Victory, since you can't have enemies shooting you if you are defeating them and crowd controlling them or whatever, but you can keep healing with this if you do that. So if you're a Naros and you pocket sand enemies and they're not shooting you anymore, you can't heal with Arcane Grace. You probably don't need to heal with Arcane Grace, but you can't. Whereas with this, you can. And in fact, they're CC'd, so it should be easy to get headshot kills. So for what it's worth, I think this is quite solid. And for all intents and purposes, is basically Arcane Grace, but with a different, meaningfully different, but not big deal activation condition. Moving on to Strike. A very valuable one, pretty classic arcane. This is attack speed for melee weapons. It's a lot of attack speed. Melee mod slots are worth quite a bit compared to primary, secondary mod slots, because there are so many more good melee mods that do different things. So there are very few melee builds where if you had another mod slot, you couldn't add another multiplier. You almost always can. And so having another melee mod slot is worth a lot more on average than having another whatever mod slot. So any mod that is good, any arcane that is going to give you a melee mod slot in practice is going to be pretty good. And again, you shouldn't think of this as stacking up a bunch of melee attack speed. This is much more about the ability to not have an attack speed mod on your melee weapon, but still have it go usably fast. You shouldn't think of it as, now the maximum attack speed I can get is higher. If you do want to think of it that way, that's fine, but it's not mathematically efficient, and you should be aware that, your input method might not be able to use all that attack speed. There are animation caps, so it might just not even be possible in the game to use that much attack speed. So obviously, if you can't use it, it doesn't do anything. May I recommend binding melee attacking to your mouse wheel if you're on PC? But anyway, I mean, that doesn't mean it's bad to get a lot of attack speed, and attack speed is sort of like the multi-shot of melee in a way. So, it's a good effect. I just wouldn't stack up a bunch of it, that's all. Anyway, super easy activation condition, lots of attack speed, long duration, good mod. Good Arcane. They're basically mods. They're mods that go on your Warframe slots for your weapons. Awakening. So I think this is pretty bad. This is a worse way to get base damage from an Arcane than other Arcanes, like Arachne, and it only affects secondaries. As we talk more base damage Arcanes, I think this will look worse and worse, but there are some weapons that reload very frequently, and maybe you do only care about your secondaries damage. I still think Arcane Arachne blows this out of the water, but they are different when we get there, and Arcane Arachne is rare and this is uncommon. I don't think this is worth it though. Guardian doesn't need much of an introduction. Again, flat armor for every frame is extremely solid. Every frame now has 1,000 or more total armor. Amazing. Congratulations. You have now survived Warframe. Most things that give flat values are pretty amazing in Warframe overall, and this is no exception. Pretty much every frame that doesn't already have a way to defend themselves now can just tank the content that we're going to be rewarded for playing, which is pretty solid. This doesn't work through things that prevent damage, like Rhino's Iron Skin and Revenant's Mesmer Skin, but those frames do not need this, and everybody else can use it. I would say Phantasm is a little questionable, so this doesn't have a cooldown. Of course, you can just keep it active all the time by blocking. And it's not hard to activate. A parry in Melee 3.0 is just an auto block, so that's not too bad. But even then, you're getting 60% speed compared to Consequence's 60% parkour velocity. And I feel that speed is less valuable. The reason speed is less valuable is because when you try to go fast, it's easier to get more speed than more parkour velocity. So if you're stacking up a bunch of speed boosts, let's say you're Volt, trying to go fast, and you're going to run on the ground, you can get a lot of speed. Like, there's many speed things, and so the marginal benefit of 60% more speed is not that high. Whereas if you have Consequence, that's 60% parkour velocity, if you stack up all the parkour velocity you can get, there's not that much, and so the marginal benefit of 60% more is higher, even though they're the same amount, supposedly. Obviously, parkour velocity and speed do not make you the same amount faster, but you get it. All things being equal, the same amount of parkour velocity is of higher value, theoretically. I still think this is decent for racing, but that's just my janky capture mission racing game mode, not like a main thing you're doing in the game. And I think if you're trying to speedrun missions or farm, this is probably not as good as Consequence, so I don't recommend it for what it's worth. Eruption. This one is a little weird. So this effect doesn't have a cooldown at all. Every time you pick up an energy orb, you do a knockdown wave. Every single time. Which, but knockdown can be inconvenient at times, and you don't have great control over when this happens. I just don't think the payoff is there, but it could be decent if you kill enemies from far away, and then leave the loot on the ground only to later dive in and trigger a ton of knockdowns as a sort of panic button. So looking at it that way, maybe this has potential use in stationary missions like defense. So I don't know, I don't think this is thrilling, but it does have no cooldown, that's solid. You can sort of control when you collect energy orbs. We have Arcane Agility next. So this is, again, somewhat good for going fast. This is when you take damage, you get parkour velocity, pretty reliably, but not guaranteed. Again, I feel like you're jumping hoops compared to going for Consequence. Like, why not just have Consequence? But it's not that it's bad for going fast, I just think this has that Arcane Victory thing with Arcane Grace, where I think you're better off with an activation condition you can control, getting a headshot for Arcane Consequence, than when your enemies have to trigger, getting damaged with this. So I don't think it's as good as Consequence for what it's worth, but you can only run one Consequence. I don't know, it's not worthless. For racing, I think this is interesting because when you get to the capture target, you'll probably get shot, and this would likely trigger. And the duration is pretty long, so it's okay. Acceleration. This is fire rate for primary weapons when you get a crit. This is pretty solid. That's great. Fire rate is good, just like with attack speed on Arcane Strike. You basically get a mod slot in some senses. However, the description of this one is lying, and I'm going to harp on this. It doesn't work on shotguns, even though other arcanes that say primary weapons do include shotguns. This one says primary weapons, but what it means are rifles, not shotguns. Why doesn't it just say that? I do not understand. As someone who tries to help people make sense of and enjoy video game systems for a living, bad wording like this is a constant thorn in my side. Please try harder. This is like one of the worst things about Warframe. It just, for some reason, the wording is just not quite right almost all of the time. I do not understand why. Please try harder. This is the most irritating thing about talking about Warframe. Acceleration is fine. Trickery. So this is a little slow. It's a bit inconsistent, but the payoff is pretty high. Stealth is great, of course, and you can use the invisibility to get more finishers, and it's refreshable. But again, it's very inconsistent. It's slow. I'm not a fan when you could just use Guardian to stay alive or any number of other arcanes for more damage, but it's not like the effect is bad. It's just a bit unreliable. Arcane Velocity. So this is fire rate for secondaries, and it's a heckin' lot of it. 120%, oh baby. So this doesn't just substitute for a fire rate mod. This is significantly stronger than one as well. There are also a lot of good exalted weapons that are secondaries that this is great on. It's very easy to activate. It's basically just any crit. It gives you a huge amount of fire rate, phenomenal overall arcane. It covers a whole category by itself, unlike a certain other fire rate arcane I could mention. And it's just all around very solid. Moving on to rare arcanes. So these are 2,000 Scarlet bucks each. That's 42,000 for a max rank arcane. Now we're getting into some of the more interesting ones that you would really want to know whether you would want to purchase because they're more expensive. Precision. So this is significantly more base damage than Arachne, but it's just for secondaries, which I think is a pretty fair trade-off. It's easy to activate. It has a solid duration. Notably, this is not refreshable, but it's great when it's needed. Again, 300% damage is definitely a meaningful upgrade from 150%, and just any headshot, not a big deal. So compared to Arachne, you're at least getting a payoff for not giving every weapon base damage from an arcane. You're giving it only for secondaries, but it's a lot of it. Fair enough. Moving on to Pulse. Pulse is pretty niche in that you need to have a lot of health orbs, and health orbs don't drop very reliably. But it's very good on a select few frames, like Necros and Neja with his Chakram augment. It's decent elsewhere with a Sentinel with Synth Deconstruct. You don't naturally get health orbs that often, meaningfully often, so I don't think you should use this unless you have a way to get significantly more, but Synth Deconstruct means a lot of the time you do get significantly more. I think this is a very bad Generalist Arcane, which is totally fine. We have plenty of good Generalist Arcanes, but the payoff is pretty high here. I mean, it's a lot of healing, it's kind of passive healing too, which is pretty solid. Arcane Ultimatum. This is a weird one because it's kind of just Guardian. Like, there isn't really much benefit to getting a little more armor, but then instead of it activating basically automatically from you taking damage, you have to do finishers to activate it. The duration it's active is really long. 45 seconds is a very long time for it to be active, so it's not the end of the world. But you could also just use Arcane Tanker. That's an arbitration one, that when you deploy your arc gun, you get flat armor about this much for about this long. And so, personally, I think that's kind of an easier activation condition. But again, there are frames like Rhino who are interested in getting more armor, but they can't activate Arcane Guardian while they have, in Rhino's case, Iron Skin on. So sure, it's not like awful or anything. I just think Arcane Guardian is cheaper and better almost all of the time. Arcane Aegis. This one is complicated. So I don't overly recommend this excellent arcane, and I'm going to tell you why. It's incredible right now, in no small part due to shield gating, not only because of shield gating, but in no small part due to the way shield gating has been implemented. And shield gating is a potentially, nerfable thing. It's something that has been put in the game very recently, and it is probably going to get weaker at some point because it's a recent addition. I think it's pretty unbalanced, and again, it's just a very recent addition, so there's a high chance it will change at some point. So I wouldn't encourage relying on it or prioritizing it. But again, Aegis is not bad without shield gating. It's just currently this is kind of busted, but it's really only because shield gating is so unfair, I would argue, at the moment. Aegis doesn't give overshields, or it would also be busted beyond imagination, but it's still a whole lot of shield regen, and shields do now have 25% damage reduction. This is surprisingly strong on frames with even average amounts of shields, because you're getting back 30% of your shields every second for 12 seconds. That's an insane amount of shields. Like, that's a lot. So yay, frame build diversity. You can survive with shields as well. Again, I just think it's better to evaluate this assuming shield gating gets weaker, since it's still good on its own and we don't know what might happen there. But it's not bad if shield gating just didn't exist right now. Like, this is still good. So you shouldn't avoid it if you're interested in it. I just think you should not think about whether you want it because of shield gating. That's all. Arcane Arachne. We talked about this already. We've been talking about this the whole time. Easy to activate, base damage for everything. Great Arcane. Arcane Rage. This is a little funny. So again, not much more base damage than Arachne, and it's only for primaries. For this one, the activation chance is also a bit low. In comparing this to Arachne, Precision and Precision as well, it's just not that great. Again, Arcane Precision is a lot more damage for pistols, and Arachne is less damage, but it's for all your weapons, whereas this is not that much more damage than Arachne, but only for one part of your loadout. Now this one says primary weapons, and it actually means all your primary weapons, so this includes shotguns, whereas that other fire rate one did not include shotguns. Arcane Acceleration, Arcane Tempo are for rifles and shotguns, even though Acceleration says primary weapons, this says primary weapons, and it's for all primary weapons. Why? But anyway, that's how it works. Fury. So this is basically Arcane Rage, but for melee weapons. Again, it's not much more than Arachne gives you, and it's only for one part of your loadout instead. Again, I think the conditions are attractive to some people, and I get that. A headshot or a crit is... It's not that it's easier to do than a wall latch, it's just that you'll do it automatically. Like, you don't have to go out of your way to do anything. I just feel that if you try using Arachne, you're not going to be in situations where you can't activate it often enough that you're going to feel like it's worth losing so much damage across your loadout in exchange for just not wall latching for like 1/2 a second every 30 seconds. Now, one concern some people have had about this is, like, if you're in an open world, then you can't easily just wall latch, right? Because you're in an open world. Try using this in Plains of Eidolon or in the Orvalis, and you'll find that where you are actually playing and fighting against enemies, you can consistently wall latch. If you're just in any random part of Plains of Eidolon or the Orvalis, yes, you cannot wall latch because you're in an open field or on a mountain or something. But where you are actually fighting enemies when you're playing out there, you are consistently able to wall latch. I use this all the time out there, usually playing off stream. I just liked wandering around in those environments because they're very pretty. And this is very easy to activate when you actually need it in those environments. So I do still recommend it. Finally, we come to Avenger. I talked about this a bit before. Flat critical chance, good activation rate. Flat things are good. It's the Arcane Guardian of offensive arcanes. I don't know. But Avenger is more of a set and forget thing than something like Arachne. And so I think there is some general good value there. I don't think that it's necessarily better, it's just different. And something to keep in mind is that this is not that great if you have a weapon that already has good critical chance. So if you're running, say, Dread, then you have Point Strike, and you have a whole heckin' lot of critical chance already. And this doesn't, it gives you, 45% is a decent amount more, but it's really not that much more. Like, you're adding on 45% to your 125% or whatever that you already have. You'll notice, but the marginal benefit is really not that high, and so it's nothing to get hugely excited about on those weapons. The big use of this is to make weapons like the Kuva Nukor, or actually the weapon from this event, the Basmu. So this thing has a secondary fire mode that has 4.8 times crit multiplier, but really low crit chance. The main thing about Avenger is that you can use it to make things that wouldn't otherwise be critting crit, which that's awesome. That's a fantastic use for it, and it's good for general damage too. I do think it is not just another general damage arcane like Arachne. I think it is a little different. Finally, moving on to legendary arcanes. These are 4,000 Scarlet Buckaroonies. That's 84,000 for a max rank arcane. So again, we had 1,000 for common, 1,500 for uncommon, 2,000 for rare, and now 4,000, not 2,500, for legendary. I don't necessarily think that is or isn't a problem. I just to be clear, the pattern breaks, right? So these are very, very expensive. And I'm happy that we get to talk about them because they are big ticket items. And let's talk about Energize. Here we go. Not much of an introduction necessary. It is powerful in almost every conceivable loadout. Other forms of energy regeneration are still worth it since this requires energy orbs, but goodness does this give you a whole lot. Now, the difficult thing here is to say, why would you not get Energize? Like, what's motivating you to get anything else? I really do feel that you do not need this. It really isn't a game-changing arcane in the sense that there are other sources of large amounts of energy regeneration, and many frames, while they can use a mountain of energy, a wellspring of energy, they don't necessarily gain a huge amount from it. Like, they're not looking for that much energy. There are frames where you can play with, you get an insane amount of energy every time you get an energy orb, and you can play around that, sure. But I do think this is a little, I'm gonna say a word, overrated, only in the sense that it is so unnecessary. Like, you really don't need it that much. And what you're actually gaining when this gives you a ton of energy is very, very good, don't get me wrong. But on a lot of frames, just kind of unnecessary. Like, you simply don't need it that much. A really good example of this not really doing anything would be like Chroma. You have your Vex Armor and your Elemental Ward, and yes, this will help you make sure you can refresh those on time, but Chroma doesn't have any way to dump energy to get value. A lot of frames don't have any way to dump energy to get value. There are also frames like Excalibur, where yes, you can throw out more Radial Blinds if you're using Exalted Blade, which is not bad, and it makes sure you're topped off when you're channeling Exalted Blade, sure. But I don't really have trouble maintaining that ability, personally. I think if you have some decent efficiency, it's not that hard to maintain. Yes, you can drop the efficiency, and maybe it'll be okay when you get energy orbs. But again, I feel like it's not a complete solution in that if you don't get energy orbs, you're still going to run out of energy. This just gives you way more when you're already getting some, which makes it very powerful. But I don't think it is a totally game-changing arcane that you absolutely must have. So no pressure not to get this. You should feel not at all bad. You should feel reasonable for skipping this, but that doesn't mean I don't recommend it. Guardian. Grace. Hahaha, Freudian slip, because this arcane is very good when you have lots of damage reduction. This is popular on frames like Inaros and Grendel, but it is also very good in situations where you simply have a lot of damage reduction. If your 6% of your health is worth a lot because you have a lot of damage reduction, this is pretty good. This is quite solid. It's just, again, it's so unnecessary, and a lot of the time it may not be enough to sustain you on its own. A lot of the time it is enough. There are frames like Mesa who just have a lot of damage reduction they have access to, and a decent health pool. There are frames like Grendel and Inaris that simply have a gigantic health pool. There are frames that are kind of in between, like Nidus is a good example, lots of damage reduction and lots of health. Not necessarily as much, but still a lot. And so this is pretty good generally. This is not a very limited arcane. It doesn't have to be a very limited arcane, but how often do you really... Is it the obvious choice? I'm not so sure. And recall that you can get Arcane Victory for half the price, and a little less than half the price. It's an uncommon. And you will still be healing passively while fighting. You just have to kill enemies with headshots rather than taking damage. The activation condition of this is a little tiny bit low as well. Like, you have to take damage, but it's only a 9% chance. I don't think it's the end of the world, but it is worth saying this is one of those things where you do need to be able to take a few hits for it to activate. This can't just make you tanky all by itself. Finally, we come to Arcane Barrier. This is one of the ones I think is most important to discuss because I think it's pretty bad. So the thing about Barrier is that it's more expensive than Aegis, and it's kind of worse. It's only really good if you're taking damage often because it's got a low activation chance, and you need to have lost a lot of shields for it to gain you a lot. But if you're taking damage often, Aegis is worth way more shields because it regenerates 30% every second for like 12 seconds. So this, at the most, gives you 100% of your shields. And if you're activating it at some unknown time throughout your time losing your shields, but you have to take shield damage, so you have to have some amount of shields. On average, you're probably getting back about 50% of your shields with this. So Arcane Aegis would be giving you back 30% over the course of some seconds, which is way more than 100%. So you are gaining way more shields from Aegis if you're taking damage, and this will only activate consistently if you're taking a lot of damage. So I don't think this is great. It is really amazing on Hildren. One trick for making both of these work better is to add some overshields to your loadout. Like, you could run a few augur mods here and there that will restore shields into overshields, but not stack up more. That will help because it will mean that you can always get more of a buffer room to take more damage and activate these. That's helpful. That can make it better. But I do not think there's a reason to use this over Aegis, and I don't think there are a lot of frames where this makes sense if you already have Aegis. Again, on Hildren, the payoff is so high that because you can just stand there and infinitely tank with those shields, that sure, get it, fine, if you absolutely love Hildren. But I have a lot of copies of this, and I sort of wish I didn't because I don't think they're worth it. So for what it's worth, I think this is one to skip for most of you. While we're here at the end, I guess for everything else you can buy besides Arcanes, I recommend getting the Basmu, and I don't directly recommend getting anything else unless you have a specific reason you want it. Personally, I really like the new Simulacrum room, and I really dislike how these new clan sigils look. They're just not, for me, they're a little bit fuzzy and busy. They're not just the sigil, I don't feel, not as much as I would like anyway. The stance format doesn't really seem useful to me on most melee weapons. There just aren't a ton of weapons where if it's just for the weapon to be viable and powerful, you really want to change between multiple stances that have different polarities on them. I just don't think that is a common thing. It could be really fun if there's a weapon you simply like changing the stances on, but a lot of weapons currently have either multiple stances with the same form polarity already, or they only have one stance. So there aren't even that many weapons where this does anything, let alone weapons where it does something and you want it to do that thing. So personally, I really don't recommend this. The Seti Lacera is statistically very good, but it is ultimately just another really good melee weapon. There's a lot of good melee weapons. I love Blade and Whips. I might get this just because I really like Blade and Whips, but it is kind of a Jack Kassar with more status than crit instead of more crit than status, which is not to say it's bad. I sort of already have what it is offering, that's all. And let's see, I'll probably buy one of each decoration because I like floating things in my ship. For what it's worth, that's what I think. I hope that helped. I hope it was interesting. If you have any other questions, I will try to answer them in the comments. Happy hunting, happy shopping. Don't burn yourself out. Don't feel like you need to get a bunch of Arcanes. Pick and choose, make yourself a shopping list. Put it in order of what you want the most, what you would be okay with skipping. Consider that the more common Arcanes, you could do Eidolons and get them pretty consistently. For what it's worth, those are my opinions on that stuff, and I hope they helped. I'll see you next time.